Okay, so to get this rear differential out, you can see in here where the brake line junction is. There's a small bracket here that bolts to the chassis. Let's see if I can get some more light here. Give me a sec. Okay, this bracket's right up here. And then these two brake lines screw right into it. Okay, so that's the first thing I got taken care of. Once we pulled that off, you can see that this vertical shock here is mounted in the trunk. You can see the bolt back there. I went ahead and pulled the nut off of that, and then pulled the nut off of that one. And I have a jack underneath here supporting the weight of the differential. So what I'm going to do is move over to the other side, go ahead and disconnect the brake lines, same thing, and then we'll move on to the quad shock assembly, which is this guy here. We'll pull that nut off that bolt, pull this shock off from the chassis, and then hopefully we can get some more room because the differential itself should pivot downward. Okay, alright, I'll catch up with you in a sec. Okay, so to get to the next piece of the puzzle out of here, we're going to pull off this lower control arm right here, and we're going to do it up in the chassis. So, get down here now. You can see the lower control arm is held on by that nut and bolt, and the other one, or the other end of the spectrum, runs way over here. And you can see it goes inside that hole cut out in the unibody. So what I did was I went ahead and, since there's not a whole lot of room between the exhaust, I grabbed my breaker bar, an 18mm short well socket, and put it on there, and then wedged her up. So that should hold, and it should force itself against the chassis when I apply counterclockwise pressure. Let's see if I can get in here. Come on that nut there. So hopefully the bolt will come all the way out with that exhaust where it's at. If not, then I'm going to take the Sawzall, cut that piece of exhaust off, and we'll pretty much go from there. So alright, so moving on to the rear drive shaft where it attaches to the pinion yoke. Those are 12mm and 12-point bolts. So what's that mean? There we go. So the socket itself has to have 12 points of contact on the bolt itself. So here we go. No big surprise. Alright, slightly bigger gun here. One more thing I like to do here when I'm taking something off and see the drive shaft's balanced. These are one of the couple of the balancing weights. It may not be super critical in this situation, but I always like to make a mark right where they were originally bolted together, and then I'll orient it back on that same mark again. Maybe it helps, maybe it doesn't, you know, who knows. You probably get 100 different answers from 100 different people. So go ahead and do that. It's like saving your process on the computer. Hit the save button, that way you can return back to it and do it right. So, alright, rear differential, same cleaning process as before. We hit it with mineral spirits and then power washed it. Get a power washer, it's going to help with everything. And then after we power washed it, I got it up on these big jack stands and started noticing that it's got some silicone boogers hanging off of it and extra silicone coming out of the bolt holes. So don't think that Ford does that kind of a job with rear differential sealing, so we're gonna pull the rear diff cover off and see what's going on in there. Maybe it's good news. Maybe somebody put a 411 and track lock or 456s in it, or maybe it's bad news that it's junk. Either way, we'll pull this off and then address it. All right, so the removal of the rear end and the lower and upper control arms. So a couple specific tools you'll want to have on hand. Everything's 18 millimeter, but you're going to want a ratcheting wrench, and then this offset box end wrench is extremely important too. I'll show you where in just a second. Grab a 1/4 inch drive, really long extension, because this is really what helps us get the differential and the lower control arms out in one fell swoop. So we'll look down here. And so again, they're both 18 mil. But the trick is getting the nut off's easy, because you can get that from outside of the car as you come in this way. But sometimes this bolt, and all the bolts, well not sometimes, but all the time, the bolt has friction from the chassis and the lower control arm itself. And that's where this 1/4 inch drive comes in, and it gives you that little bit of extra pop to be able to knock these things out. And it gives you enough length to get that done. So I'll show you where that's at inside the chassis as well, and why you need these two. Right. Yes. Okay, so the front shock mount that we just discussed is actually found on the rear end. So when we pull the rear shock out, there is a shock mount there that's going to be transferred to the front. So as you look underneath here, there's the nut that's going to hold this shock mount on, and we'll pull this nut off and pull this whole assembly off. Then we'll machine the front lower A-arm. Now, to mount the shocks on the back of this, there is another bracket that goes on, so this piece isn't used anymore on the back of the car. So we'll pull that off, and then we'll catch back up with you. All right, so let's go ahead and pull these rear calipers off. So let's blow the rear cover off and see what we got going on underneath here. So 3L27, that's a 327 gear ratio, and the L denotes a locker. So according to the tag, that's what should be in the rear end here. And as we zoom into the actual ring gear, they say on the gear what they are, and that's 327. So looks like we've got 327s in the rear end here. Alright, so we'll go ahead and pour the fluid out here, and then clean off all this gasket material that's extra. That's actually inside of the housing. So we'll get rid of all that garbage too. Put some new fluid in it with the track lock additive. and it should be around 2 quarts. So let's pour her out and get her filled up again. Yeah, so anyway, here we go. So here's a quick tip to clean out the differential housing bolts where the cover bolts to. I don't like to use taps because I think taps cut metal out of the housing, and so what I like doing is taking a bolt from my bolt box that is the same thread pitch as the original bolt that I'm trying to get a cleaner for, and so I match up the threads and then take a die grinder and then I'll grind channels out of the bolt so I can run this bolt in and clean out the threads, and I'll do this a couple times depending on how thick and how full of crud the differential housing is, and clean that out, and I don't damage any of the threads in the housing itself or cut them or make them weaker. So just a quick tip, I'll run over that real quick here. Okay, 75/90 with limited slip additive. Oh man, that's wild. Alright, we'll finger tighten it till it dries, and then we'll put the final torque on it after the sealant's actually dried up. So you probably noticed the valve in the tip of my Ultra Black here. The stop valve in there is blown out. So I put a roofing nail in it, and then I always have a ton of these rubber bands in the barn because it's excellent for fixing broken stuff and putting plastic bags around open hoses and things like that. Put your sandwich bag around it and put a rubber band, and it's excellent. Also, you can use these rubber bands for putting bolts back in, like an alternator, for example. If you pull an alternator and you don't want to get the bolts all mixed up, you go ahead and leave the bolts in the stock position and then run the rubber band around them so it retains them in their stock location when you're putting it on your workbench and kicking it around the floor, so the bolts will stay in the same spot. Cool. So this is what I was talking about a little bit earlier. So let's say I pulled this bracket off and I wanted to keep all the bolts exactly where they're supposed to be. Alright, there you go. Now you can just set this on the shelf and the bolts won't come out. Then when I've got fluid openings, I go ahead and take Ziploc bags and run a rubber band around them. And it's quick, efficient, and you can double bag them just like at the grocery store. So I don't have the right diameter brake cylinder or brake piston rewind tool that keys into this, and you turn this cylinder clockwise while pushing in. So I've got a tool, so what I'm going to do is go ahead and weld these two screw ends onto the tool itself and make the proper diameter. So here we go. Here's the 8.8 after we changed the rear end fluid, put a new gasket on, and shot a coat of paint on it. After wire wheeling everything, looks pretty sharp. Now I'm going to go ahead and install the axle brackets. Okay, this is the driver's side axle bracket. And these bolts go right through the existing mount holes, only after they've been drilled out to 1/2 inch. This is a shock bolt. It's going to go through the original bracket and the axle bracket. And a shock spacer. And lock nut. Alright, so now we're going to go ahead and install the spring perches. This is where we're going to spin our stock coil spring on. This guy, it's a good look at the chassis itself. So this guy mounts right in there. Okay, so these holes are drilled, and we have to, for the two longer bolts that come up through that square tubing, we'll have to drill holes and bolt her in. So I'm going to mount my spring perch here, and then mark the drill locations . Under here. Okay, so here's the spring perch in its stock location, which is in between the tubing itself and this little flange. And you can see here that it doesn't really find a good place to line up. And I've been messing with this for a while. And when I come over here, the spring perch itself, I'll get some light here in a second. Okay, so you can see on the spring perch that it's channeled to fit around. See the channel there? To fit around this structural tube steel. But in the stock location, there's not enough room. I mean, you can see that the channel just doesn't match up. It should be back here, which is, according to the instructions, the incorrect position to mount the spring perch. So here's our mounting flange, and here is our rectangular structural steel here. And you can see deep inside here that this structural steel meets with this piece that goes down, right? So then we'll need clearance here if we had a spring perch mount. Now in the normal position, when you have the spring perch in its recommended position, you can see in there that there is no clearance. This mount bangs against that weld and tubing. So I'm going to go ahead and move this back 3/16 of an inch, because I believe that's the size of the metal, or the mount there. And you can tell that there is clearance in the mount now around the weld and the vertical piece here, the vertical tube steel. So I'm going to push this mount back and bolt it up that way. Otherwise I've got to grind out this mount and then regrind the holes that are in here to match up with the mounting holes here. So don't think so. I'll do that and do that, and that should make the mount come back about 3/16 of an inch, but it's holding the coil spring, and I'm sure the coil spring has some flex in it. So, well, we'll figure it out. We'll go from there. Okay, that should do. So after I get through drilling, I like to run this head porting tool with 60 or 80 grit roll on here, abrasive roll, and just go in there and clean up all of the sharp ends, and then sometimes if there's a little clearancing needed, this guy does the job. So here's the coil over spring perch. All the holes are drilled and she's bolted up. So here's the Mustang quad shock mounts. This came from the donor car. The hardware is new, and this is a limiting strap here, and this goes to the rear differential and prevents the springs and shocks to overextend themselves. So we'll go ahead and bolt them up. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and install the spring on the spring perch here. Now my donor car came with eyeback springs that were 2 inches shorter in the rear and I think 1 inch in the front. So the stock springs were already high performance and had a high spring rate. Well, if anybody's driven in Michigan with these roads, a light car like this with a very strong spring rate would probably just shatter your spine. So I went ahead and I've got to vary from the kit because I just don't have the stock springs now. So I went ahead and picked up some Moroso springs, and we're going to go ahead and slide these on and then adjust them for the ride height that I want. Once everything like all the parts are in the vehicle, I'll adjust the ride height on these springs by either cutting them or see what I can do. But so the instructions call for, when you have stock springs, to cut 1 inch out of the coil. So you probably won't have to pry yours on like I did here. But again, since I'm varying from the kit and going with a different shock, or sorry, a different spring, so I'm going to go ahead and install it with its stock spring height and then make any changes after all the weight's on the vehicle. So and so right here is a good example in the instructions on how you would set your ride height in your kit here. So what happens is you put the stock rubber insulators back in after you cut it, and then according to the instructions, the stock rubber insulators in here keep the spring from moving. And so if you adjusted your ride height with the stock springs and put your rubber insulators in there, and you're like, oh wait a minute, this is too low, you could make an adjustment by rotating your springs out. And because you had the rubber insulators in there, in the book it says that the rubber insulators will keep this spring from moving around. Just the rubber insulators. Okay? Again, I'm doing things different, so I'm going right up to the top, and then I'll put the rubber insulators in, and then once all the weight's on the vehicle, I'll check out the ride height with the wheels and tires that I want, and I'll make my adjustments there. Okay, moving right along here. Here comes the rear lower control arm. This is from the donor Mustang. Now we'll go ahead and install the upper control arm. So let's take a quick look on how everything lined up. This is the lower control arm. This is the lower spring isolator, they call it. And you can see the lower control arm fits right into the spring without even having to move it around very much. Put that under there. And at least at this early stage, the mod that had to be done by moving the spring perch to the outside of the mount itself doesn't appear to have any alignment issues at this second in time, but we'll keep you updated. Alright, let's see if we can get the rear differential in this thing. And now for the quad shocks. Okay, let's do a shock install. So the shocks that came from my donor car were already high performance and valve stiffer, and so putting those in this light factory 5 would probably pulverize my spine and pelvis, so especially on Michigan roads. So I went ahead, since I had to order shocks anyway, I went ahead and picked up 3-way adjustable drag shocks. Now if you look at the build here and think about it, got a solid axle, 4-link, and a light car. This thing should get down for sure. So you may as well build it to where its strengths are. So we've got, also I've got Moroso drag springs in the back as well. So she ought to get down. So these shocks have 3 settings. You grab up here and make sure this is bottomed out. In other words, this threaded piece is pushed into the shock as far as possible, and you'll turn it clockwise and you'll listen for the click. Whichever click is the loudest is the first click, and then that'll be the R setting. So I want an extra firm setting to start with, so I'm going to go the first click loud and then 3 clicks after. Okay, that's the loudest. Second click, third click. So that is XF for extra firm. So Factory 5 provides 1 bushing for the shock mount, and Competition Engineering provides 1 as well. Here's our axle strap to limit the downward motion of the axle in case you take it Dukes of Hazzard style. So what I've done here is I've loaded the car down with a bunch of extra batteries that I have laying around the shop. For some reason I like to collect batteries. Some of them work, some don't. But I went ahead and loaded this down, so it represents approximately 200-pound driver, 150-pound passenger, and about 45 to 50 pounds of fuel in the back. And so what I'll do is I'll jack this up in the air and I'll tighten all the suspension bolts down in a approximate ride height position. So that way when it actually gets all the parts on it, the suspension bushings, once I tighten these bolts down, they'll be in a ride height setting versus at full droop and tear the bushings up. So we're going to go ahead and do the best we can with these weights here and then just ride it out, see what happens. So this is going to be the end of the rear end and rear suspension segment of the Factory 5 series. Please like and subscribe and leave some comments. Thanks. See you next time.